12-year-old Daniel had always felt invisible. Ever since his mother passed away, his father buried himself in work, leaving Daniel alone in a house that no longer felt like home. School wasn't any better. He wasn't the fastest, the smartest, or the most popular. He was just there, forgotten. But everything changed the day he met Shadow. It happened on a late autumn afternoon. Daniel wandered to the old ranch at the edge of town, where the abandoned horses were kept. He had no real reason to be there, just another place to escape to. But as he passed the wooden fences, he noticed something unusual. A black horse stood apart from the others, unmoving. There was something different about this one. The way it held its head low, the way it barely reacted to the other horses moving around it. Daniel took a step closer, and that's when he noticed the cloudy, milky white eyes. The horse was blind. Daniel's heart clenched. He knew what it felt like to be left behind. Slowly, he approached, careful not to startle the animal. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "Can you hear me?" The horse twitched an ear but didn't move away. Encouraged, Daniel reached out a hand. Then, out of nowhere, the horse let out a sharp huff and stepped back, almost stumbling. Daniel froze. He didn't understand much about horses, but he understood fear. And this horse, Shadow, was terrified. "It's okay," Daniel said softly. "I won't hurt you." But Shadow didn't believe him. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, Daniel kept coming back. He didn't try to touch Shadow anymore, just sat nearby talking. About school, about how his dad barely looked at him, about how it felt to lose someone and to have the whole world move on like nothing happened. "I bet you feel that way too, huh?" he murmured one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of pink and orange. "Like everyone else can just run, but you're stuck in the dark." Shadow's ears twitched. It was the first time the horse had responded to his voice. Something inside Daniel stirred. Maybe, just maybe, Shadow understood. And maybe, if Daniel could help the horse trust him, he wouldn't feel so alone either. One crisp morning, Daniel arrived at the ranch early. As usual, he found Shadow standing alone. But something was different. Shadow wasn't standing as far away as before. Hope flickered in Daniel's chest. Slowly, carefully, he reached out his hand. "It's just me, buddy," he whispered. "You know me now." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Shadow did something Daniel never expected. He stepped forward. Daniel's fingers brushed against the horse's muzzle, warm, soft, alive. His breath caught. "You trust me now." Shadow didn't move away. For the first time in weeks, Daniel smiled. They were no longer just a lonely boy and a blind horse. There was something more. Daniel's visits became a daily routine. He wasn't sure if Shadow waited for him, but every time he arrived, the horse was always there, standing still, ears twitching, as if listening for him. One afternoon, Daniel brought a small apple, holding it just under Shadow's nose. "Here, buddy, try this." Shadow sniffed hesitantly, then gently took the apple with his lips. Daniel grinned. "See, I won't trick you." Shadow chewed slowly, then gave a little snort, almost like approval. But trust was only the first step. Daniel wanted to do more than just befriend Shadow. He wanted to help him move again. The stable owner, Mr. Harris, had once told him that blind horses often stood still because they were afraid of bumping into things. But if they had the right guide, they could learn to walk, run, even race. Daniel's heart pounded at the thought. Could he be that guide for Shadow? There was only one way to find out. Daniel started small. He stood beside Shadow and gently ran his fingers down the horse's neck. "We're going to take a step forward, okay?" Shadow flicked his ears, but didn't move. Daniel took a deep breath and pressed a hand lightly against Shadow's side. "Trust me." Shadow hesitated. Then he stepped forward. Daniel's heart soared. "That's it. You did it." Encouraged, he tried again. This time, Shadow stepped twice. Every day, they practiced. Step by step, Daniel learned how to use his voice to guide Shadow, how to let him know when to stop, when to turn. And Shadow learned something too. He learned that he wasn't alone in the dark anymore. A month later, something incredible happened. Daniel was leading Shadow in slow circles around the field when the wind picked up. Leaves rustled. The cool autumn air swirled around them. And suddenly, without warning, Shadow moved on his own. Not just a step, not just a walk, a trot. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't pulled the rope. He hadn't given a command. Shadow had felt the wind and followed it. Daniel ran alongside him, laughter bubbling up in his chest. "You did it, Shadow. You're running." Shadow snorted, tossing his head, his black coat shining in the sunlight. For the first time since he'd gone blind, he wasn't afraid. He trusted Daniel, and together they were unstoppable. The next few weeks were magical. Shadow no longer hesitated when Daniel called him. He no longer stood still, frozen in fear. He moved. At first, it was just slow walks around the field. But soon, Daniel began jogging beside him, clicking his tongue as a signal. Shadow understood. He matched Daniel's pace, his hooves thudding softly against the dirt. And then, one incredible afternoon, it happened. Daniel picked up speed. "Come on, Shadow. Let's go." Shadow flicked his ears, lifted his head, then galloped. The wind roared past them. Daniel couldn't keep up, but he didn't care. He watched, breathless, as Shadow ran blind, yet fearless. The other ranch workers stopped to stare. Mr. Harris stepped outside, his mouth hanging open. "That horse is blind, how is he running?" But Daniel knew the answer. Shadow wasn't running alone anymore. He was running with him. But not everyone believed in Shadow's progress. One afternoon, as Daniel was brushing Shadow's mane, he overheard two stable hands talking. "That boy's wasting his time." One of them scoffed. "A blind horse can never race." "Yeah," the other muttered. "It's just false hope." Daniel's hands clenched. He turned back to Shadow, running a hand over his strong, muscular neck. "They don't know you," he whispered. "But I do." Still, doubt crept in. Was he pushing Shadow too hard? Was he just imagining the possibility of something greater? That night, as he lay in bed, the words echoed in his mind. "A blind horse can never race." But then he remembered the feeling of the wind rushing past him. He remembered the way Shadow chose to run. And deep inside, he knew the truth. Shadow wasn't broken. And together, they were going to prove it. The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He marched up to Mr. Harris, heart pounding. "I want to enter Shadow in the town race." The stable owner nearly dropped his coffee. "Daniel, that's a professional competition. The other horses can see." "Shadow, I know he's blind." Daniel interrupted. "But he can feel the wind. He can listen to me. He can run." The days following the race were a whirlwind. Newspapers ran headlines like "The Blind Champion," "Shadow's Unbelievable Victory," and "The Boy Who Helped a Horse See Without Eyes." People from all over the town and beyond came to see the black stallion who had defied all odds. But for Daniel and Shadow, nothing had changed. Every morning, Daniel arrived at the ranch. Every morning, Shadow waited for him. "We're not done yet, buddy," Daniel said one afternoon, running his hand over Shadow's mane. "Winning one race isn't enough. We've got more to prove." Because despite their victory, there were still skeptics. Some called it a fluke. Others said Shadow had just gotten lucky. Daniel wasn't going to let anyone call his best friend a mistake. He had an idea, a big idea, and it was crazier than anything he had ever dreamed before. Daniel knocked on Mr. Harris's office door. The old rancher looked up from his paperwork. "You look like a kid about to ask me something real reckless." Daniel grinned. "I am." Mr. Harris sighed. "All right, let's hear it." Daniel took a deep breath. "I want Shadow to compete in the National Derby." Silence. Mr. Harris blinked. "Son, do you know what you're saying?" "Yes, that's the biggest horse race in the country." "I know. Only the best of the best compete there. Horses trained from birth, with the best trainers, best riders." "I know." Daniel's eyes burned with determination. "And that's why we have to go." Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair. He studied Daniel for a long moment, rubbing his chin. Then he shook his head, but he was smiling. "You really don't give up, do you?" Daniel grinned. "Nope." Mr. Harris exhaled. "All right, kid. If you want to race against the best, we've got a lot of work to do." And just like that, a new chapter of their journey began. Shadow wasn't just a town legend anymore. He was heading for the biggest race of them all. And this time, the whole world would be watching. Daniel knew the National Derby wasn't just another race. This was the real proving ground, where only the finest, fastest, and most highly trained horses competed. And Shadow, he was still the underdog. But Daniel didn't care. He believed. So the training became more intense. Mr. Harris brought in professional trainers to help. They studied Shadow's movements, adjusted his strides, and refined the signals Daniel used to guide him. Every morning, Daniel ran alongside Shadow, practicing their commands until they were seamless. He experimented with new ways to signal turns, using wind direction, sounds, and even rhythmic taps against Shadow's neck. And Shadow, he adapted. Where others saw blindness as a limitation, Shadow turned it into an advantage. Unlike other horses, he wasn't distracted by movement, flinching at shadows, or reacting to other racers. He focused, and he trusted Daniel completely. "You're not just racing against other horses this time, buddy," Daniel told him one evening. "You're racing against expectations, and we're going to break every single one of them." News of Shadow's upcoming race spread fast. Some called him a miracle horse. Others still doubted. A blind horse in the National Derby. It's a publicity stunt. He won a small-town race, but this is different. He won't even make it past the first round. Daniel ignored them. He focused on training, but deep down, the pressure was heavier than ever. This wasn't just about proving Shadow's ability anymore. It was about proving to the world that a horse with no sight, when given trust, love, and the right partner, could run with the best, maybe even win. And then, just a week before the race, disaster struck. It was a routine training run. The track was clear. The signals were perfect. Shadow moved with power and confidence. Then, a loud noise. A truck backfired near the stables. It was just for a second, just a moment of confusion. But in that second, Shadow's front hoof clipped an uneven patch of dirt. Daniel barely had time to react. Shadow stumbled. Then, he fell. The massive stallion hit the ground hard, his body sliding against the dirt track. Dust flew everywhere. Daniel's heart stopped. Shadow, he ran to him, dropping to his knees. Shadow was breathing hard, struggling to get up. His legs trembled. Mr. Harris and the trainers rushed over. "Easy, boy," one of them soothed. Shadow finally stood, but something was wrong. He wasn't standing evenly. His right front leg was shaking. "We need to check him," one of the trainers said urgently. Daniel swallowed hard. "Tell me he's okay." The vet arrived within minutes, examining Shadow's leg carefully. Then she looked at Daniel with a serious expression. "It's not broken, but it's a bad strain." Daniel let out a breath of relief until she continued. "He'll need at least a month to fully recover." Silence. Daniel felt like the air had been knocked out of his chest. A month. The National Derby was in a week. Shadow was hurt, and their dream, the race they had worked so hard for, was slipping away. Daniel clenched his fists. This couldn't be the end. Not like this. But for the first time, he didn't know what to do. Daniel sat outside Shadow's stall, his head in his hands. The vet's words echoed in his mind. He'll need at least a month to fully recover. A month. But they only had a week before the race. Shadow stood inside the stall, his right front leg wrapped in a protective bandage. He wasn't limping badly, but he wasn't at full strength either. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. For the first time, doubt crept in. Should I pull him from the race? The thought made his stomach churn, but he couldn't ignore the truth. If Shadow ran injured, he could get really hurt. maybe even never race again. Mr. Harris approached, leaning on the stall door. "Tough break, kid." Daniel nodded slowly. "It's not fair." Mr. Harris sighed. "Life ain't fair. You gotta decide. Do you want to push him and risk everything? Or let him heal and try again next year?" Next year. Daniel clenched his jaw. He didn't want to wait. But then he looked at Shadow. The stallion flicked his ears, standing still, waiting, trusting him. This wasn't just his dream. It was theirs. And Daniel had a choice. Win at any cost, or protect his best friend. That night, Daniel barely slept. He kept replaying everything in his mind. Then an idea struck. A crazy, reckless, impossible idea. But if it worked, it could change everything. The next morning, he marched straight to Mr. Harris's office. "I have a plan." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "I'm almost scared to ask." Daniel took a deep breath. "Shadow won't run the full race, but I'm not pulling him out either." Mr. Harris frowned. "You lost me." Daniel leaned forward, eyes blazing. "What if Shadow only runs the final stretch?" Silence. Mr. Harris blinked. "You want to tag in a different horse for most of the race, then swap them out at the last moment?" Daniel nodded. "It's never been done before. But if Shadow just runs the last part, the part that matters, he won't strain himself too much. And we still get to prove he belongs there." Mr. Harris let out a low whistle. "Kid, that's the wildest idea I've ever heard." Daniel grinned. "So, can we do it?" Mr. Harris was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Daniel's surprise, he smiled. "Let's find out." The Derby officials weren't happy. "This isn't how races work." One of them scoffed when Daniel and Mr. Harris presented the idea. "It's never been done before." Another judge added. Daniel stood his ground. "Because no blind horse has ever raced in the Derby before. Give us a chance." More arguments followed. Some thought it was ridiculous. Some thought it was unfair. But then, the head of the Derby committee leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the desk. "There's no rule against it." Silence fell in the room. Daniel's heart pounded. "So?" he asked, barely breathing. The head judge sighed. Then he smirked. "You've got yourself a race, kid." The day of the National Derby arrived. The stadium was packed. Thousands of spectators filled the stands. Cameras broadcasted the race to millions watching at home. And in the stables, Daniel stood beside Shadow. "This is it, buddy," he murmured. "We don't have to win. We just have to show them what you can do." Shadow nudged him, as if saying, "I'm ready." The race began. The first horse, a sleek thoroughbred, took the lead for their team. The competition was fierce. The other riders pushed their horses hard, fighting for every inch. Daniel waited, his heart racing, his hands clenched into fists. Then, the final stretch approached. It was time. Daniel led Shadow to the track. The announcers' voices boomed over the stadium. And now, the moment everyone's been waiting for. The legendary blind horse, Shadow, is entering the final leg of the race. The crowd held its breath. Daniel stood beside Shadow at the handoff point. The leading rider galloped toward them, pulling back just as they reached Daniel. Daniel took the reins. "Go!" And Shadow ran. The moment Shadow's hooves hit the dirt, the crowd exploded. Gasps, cheers, and shouts filled the air. Everyone watched in disbelief as the blind stallion surged forward, his muscles rippling, his speed unmatched. Daniel ran beside him, his voice calm but firm. "Left." Shadow adjusted. "Faster." Shadow stretched his stride. The other racers were just ahead, their riders throwing desperate glances back. They had assumed this final leg would be an easy win. But now, a blind horse was gaining on them. The announcer's voice shook with excitement. "Unbelievable. Shadow is closing in. He's passing one. He's passing two." The lead rider, a seasoned professional, turned in disbelief. He had spent years training the finest racehorses. He had studied every technique, every strategy, but nothing had prepared him for this. A horse with no sight, running without fear. Daniel's signals were flawless. Every move was perfectly timed. Shadow didn't hesitate. He trusted, and with each stride, he pulled ahead, until suddenly, they were second place. One horse remained, the leader, the champion. The finish line was seconds away. Shadow was running faster than he ever had before. Daniel's lungs burned as he sprinted beside him. The leader's rider whipped his horse, urging it forward. Daniel knew it would be close. He knew they might not win, but he didn't care, because at that moment, with the whole world watching, Shadow had already won. The horse that no one believed in, the horse that had been cast aside, the blind horse. He wasn't just competing, he was fighting. He was proving them wrong. Daniel shouted the final command. Now Shadow, go. Shadow flew. The ground became a blur beneath him. The crowd screamed. And as they crossed the finish line, the world seemed to freeze. Shadow surged past the finish line, his hooves barely touching the ground. But, had they won? Daniel stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath. His heart pounded in his ears. He looked up at the massive screen above the stadium. The official photo was being reviewed. The crowd was silent. 2 horses, 2 noses. So close, so impossibly close. And then, the screen flashed. Winner, Shadow. For a second, there was nothing but shock. Then, the stadium erupted. Daniel let out a shaky laugh, stumbling forward to Shadow. He wrapped his arms around the stallion's neck, pressing his forehead against him. You did it, buddy. Shadow let out a deep, victorious whinny. Cameras flashed. Reporters rushed forward. The announcers' voices boomed over the speakers. Shadow, the first blind horse in history to win the National Derby. The second-place rider dismounted, staring at Daniel. Then, to his surprise, the rider grinned and offered his hand. I didn't believe it was possible, he admitted, but you proved us all wrong. That horse, he's more than special. He's legendary. Daniel shook his hand, pride swelling in his chest. The trophy was placed in front of him. It was massive, gleaming under the stadium lights. But Daniel barely looked at it, because the real victory was standing beside him. Shadow hadn't just won a race. He had changed history. He had proven that the strongest thing in the world, stronger than sight, stronger than doubt, was trust. And with that trust, they had done the impossible. Daniel barely had time to process what had happened before reporters surrounded him. Daniel, what does this victory mean to you? How did you train a blind horse to win the National Derby? Will Shadow race again? The flashing cameras, the shouting voices, it was overwhelming. But Daniel stayed close to Shadow, keeping a hand on his neck. This one isn't just mine, he said, voice steady despite the chaos. Shadow never needed eyes to see. He just needed someone to believe in him. And I did. That's all he ever needed. The reporters scribbled down his words. The cameras zoomed in. The world was watching. And for the first time, it wasn't watching Shadow as a disadvantaged horse. It was watching him as a champion. As the celebration died down and the crowds left the stadium, Daniel walked Shadow back to the stables. The stallion was tired but held his head high, his ears twitching as he listened to the quiet sounds of the ranch. Mr. Harris leaned against the stable door, a proud smirk on his face. You made history today, kid. Daniel chuckled. We both did. Mr. Harris nodded, then crossed his arms. But tell me something, what's next? Daniel hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't thought that far. He had spent so much time proving Shadow could race. He hadn't considered what came after. But then he looked at Shadow, standing tall, waiting for him. I think we keep going, Daniel said slowly. Shadow just showed the world what's possible. Maybe there are other horses out there like him, ones that people have given up on. Maybe we can prove they're just as strong. Mr. Harris let out a low whistle. So you want to train more impossible horses? Daniel smiled. I don't want to just race anymore. I want to change the way people see these animals. I want to give them a second chance. Mr. Harris chuckled. Well then, kid, Looks like your journey's just getting started." Daniel turned to Shadow, running a hand over his sleek black coat. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Daniel's decision wasn't just words. A week after the race, he and Mr. Harris visited a nearby ranch known for housing unwanted horses, ones considered too weak, too stubborn, or too broken to be trained. They walked through rows of stalls, each one holding a horse with a different story. Some had been abandoned after injuries. Others were simply labeled untrainable. Then Daniel stopped in front of one stall. Inside stood a small, thin mare. Her coat was a dull brown, her ribs faintly visible beneath her skin. Her ears flicked at the sound of their footsteps, but she barely moved. A ranch worker approached. "That one's called Daisy. Used to be a racehorse. Then she broke her leg a year ago. She healed, but she refuses to run now. Just stands there." Daniel stepped closer, studying the mare. Her eyes were dull, not because of blindness, but because of fear. She had lost trust in people. He turned to Mr. Harris. "She's the one." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You've already got a blind horse. Now you want one that won't run." Daniel grinned. "Exactly. Shadow taught me that impossible is just a word. Let's see if we can teach her the same." Bringing Daisy to the ranch was easy. Gaining her trust? That was hard. Unlike Shadow, who had been eager to learn, Daisy was terrified. She flinched at every movement, refused to take a single step when led, and backed away whenever Daniel approached. But Daniel refused to rush her. Instead, he sat outside her stall every day, talking softly, letting her get used to his presence. Shadow often stood nearby, his ears perked toward Daisy, as if he understood. Days passed. Then, one evening, as Daniel sat with his back against the stall door, staring at the sunset, he felt something warm press against his shoulder. His heart skipped. He turned his head slowly. Daisy was nuzzling him, a small, hesitant touch, but it meant everything. She was starting to trust again. Gaining her trust was just the first step. Now, Daniel had to help her remember what she had forgotten. Not how to run, but how to believe she could. At first, he didn't ask her to move at all. He simply walked beside her in the field, leading her gently. Then, little by little, he encouraged her to take faster steps. Shadow often trotted beside them, as if showing Daisy it was okay. One morning, Daniel stood in the open field with a rope in his hand, Daisy at his side. "Let's try something, girl," he whispered. He took a step back and gently encouraged her forward. Daisy hesitated. Her ears twitched. But then, she took a step. Then another. Then another. And suddenly, she was trotting. Daniel barely breathed. She wasn't running yet, but she was trying. And that was enough. For now. Weeks passed. Daisy grew stronger, her ribs no longer showing, her coat gleaming under the sun. Her confidence was returning, slowly but surely. She would trot beside Daniel now, following his lead, but something was still missing. She hadn't truly run. One afternoon, Daniel led Daisy and Shadow to the open field. The wind was crisp, the sky endless. Daniel knew today had to be different. He removed Daisy's lead rope and stepped back. "Go on, girl." Daisy snorted but didn't move. She had learned to trust him, but she didn't yet trust herself. Daniel glanced at Shadow. "Help her out, buddy." Shadow flicked his ears, then suddenly bolted across the field. His hooves thundered over the earth, his black coat gleaming in the light. Daisy's ears pricked. For the first time, something ignited in her eyes. She let out a deep breath. Then, she ran. Not cautiously, not hesitantly. She ran, her legs stretched, her mane whipped through the wind, and the weight of fear that had held her back for so long vanished. Daniel stood there, breathless. She wasn't just moving. She was free. Daisy slowed to a trot, then a walk, then finally stopped beside Daniel. She was breathing hard, but her head was high. Her eyes were bright. Daniel stroked her neck. "Proud of you, girl." Daisy pressed her forehead against his chest. something she had never done before. It wasn't just trust anymore. It was connection. Mr. Harris had been watching from the fence. He walked over, shaking his head. Didn't think I'd see the day. Daniel smirked. I told you, impossible is just a word. Mr. Harris chuckled. So what now? You've had a blind horse that won a derby and a mare that learned to run again. What's next? Daniel looked at both horses, his family, and he knew. We find more. Mr. Harris raised a brow. More what? Daniel smiled. More horses like them. The ones no one believes in. We train them. We show the world that they're not broken. They're just waiting for someone to see them the way they deserve to be seen. Mr. Harris let out a low whistle. You really think you can change the world, kid? Daniel looked at Shadow, at Daisy, at everything they had overcome. I don't think so, he said. I know so. And with that, his journey truly began. Because legends aren't born, they're made. Daniel's reputation was growing. People had heard about Shadow, the blind champion. They had heard about Daisy, the mare who learned to run again. And soon, something unexpected happened. One morning, a truck pulled up to the ranch. A woman stepped out, her face lined with worry. Behind her, in the trailer, was a young horse, a chestnut colt with large, frightened eyes. Daniel approached. How can I help? The woman sighed. This is Rusty. He won't eat. Daniel frowned. Is he sick? She shook her head. Not sick, just lost. He belonged to my son. My son passed away last year. Ever since then, Rusty barely touches his food. He just stands there. It's like he's waiting for something that isn't coming back. Daniel's chest tightened. He looked at Rusty. The colt's ribs were showing, his head hanging low. His ears barely twitched at the sounds around him. This wasn't just grief. This was a heart that didn't know how to heal. Daniel had seen fear. He had seen doubt. But this was loss. And loss was harder to fix than anything. Daniel didn't try to feed Rusty right away. He didn't try to force him to move, or run, or trust. Instead, he did something different. He sat with him. Every morning, after feeding Shadow and Daisy, Daniel walked into Rusty's stall and simply sat on the ground. He didn't speak. He didn't reach out. He just sat. For the first few days, Rusty didn't react. But then, one morning, as Daniel sat there, watching the sunlight filter through the wooden beams, Rusty sighed. A long, deep breath. Daniel felt his chest tighten, because it wasn't just a sigh. It was a piece of Rusty's pain, slowly, finally being released. A week passed. Rusty was still weak, still hesitant. But then, one morning, Daniel entered the stall and stopped cold. The bucket, the food bucket, it was empty. For the first time in months, Rusty had eaten. Daniel turned to him, a slow smile forming. Hey, buddy. Rusty blinked at him. And then, for the first time, he stepped forward. Just one step, but for Daniel, it felt like 1,000. Because healing wasn't about running. It wasn't about racing. Sometimes, healing was just one small step forward. And Rusty had just taken his first. The day Rusty took that step forward, something shifted. For the first time, he wasn't just existing. He was reaching out. Daniel stayed still, letting Rusty come closer on his own terms. The colt hesitated, his ears flicking back and forth, his body tense. Then, he pressed his nose against Daniel's hand. A soft, shaky touch. Daniel barely breathed. Rusty had been alone in his grief for so long, but now he was letting someone in. Daniel whispered, "It's okay, buddy. You're not alone anymore." Rusty let out a breath, warm against Daniel's palm. And just like that, a wall began to crumble. As the days passed, Rusty followed Daniel more. He no longer shrank away when Daniel entered the stall. But something still felt off. Rusty wasn't afraid. He wasn't weak. But sometimes, he would stand still for long stretches, staring at the fence line, his ears pricked forward, his body still, like he was waiting for something, or someone. One evening, as Daniel sat beside Rusty in the pasture, he finally asked. "Who are you looking for?" Rusty turned his head slightly, and in that moment, Daniel understood. Rusty wasn't just missing someone. He was waiting for his boy to come back, waiting for someone who never would. Daniel's throat tightened. "I know," he whispered. "I know it hurts." Rusty lowered his head. Daniel exhaled. "But he wouldn't want you to stay sad forever. He'd want you to run again, to be happy, to..." His voice cracked, because suddenly, he wasn't just talking to Rusty. He was talking to himself, to the parts of himself that still missed his parents, the parts that still hurt. Rusty wasn't the only one who had been waiting for something that would never return. And maybe it was time to let go. That night, the rain came. A soft drizzle at first, then harder, heavier. Daniel stood under the stable roof, watching the pasture. Shadow and Daisy had already taken shelter. But Rusty was still outside, standing in the open field. Daniel felt his chest tighten. "Rusty, come inside." But Rusty didn't move. He lifted his head, eyes closed, letting the rain soak into his coat. And then, he ran. Not out of fear. Not because he was being chased. He ran because he wanted to. Because for the first time in so long, he wasn't waiting anymore. He was living. Daniel watched, rain streaming down his face, and deep in his heart, something healed. The next morning, Rusty stood at the gate, waiting for Daniel, not staring into the distance, not searching for someone who wouldn't return, but waiting for him. Daniel smiled. "You ready, buddy?" Rusty snorted and nudged his shoulder. Daniel laughed, because he knew. Rusty wasn't just ready to trust again. He was ready to love again. And so was Daniel. Rusty's transformation was nothing short of a miracle. But there was still one thing missing. A home. Daniel had saved him, helped him heal. But he knew deep down, Rusty wasn't his horse. Shadow was his partner. Daisy was his project. Rusty was waiting for someone new. And then, one afternoon, she arrived. A young girl named Emma. She was small, with dark, curious eyes and a nervous way of holding herself. Her parents had brought her to the ranch, explaining softly that she had lost her older brother the year before. Daniel's stomach twisted, because he already knew. Emma wasn't here to just see horses. She was looking for Rusty. Emma stood a few feet away from Rusty's stall, her hands clenched at her sides. Daniel knelt beside her. "You can go closer." Emma hesitated. "What if he doesn't like me?" Daniel smiled. "Then we'll try again tomorrow." Emma swallowed hard, then took a step forward. Rusty lifted his head. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Rusty took a step toward her. Emma froze. Rusty lowered his head, sniffing her hand, and let out a quiet breath. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "He's soft." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, he is." Emma's small fingers reached forward, trembling, and touched Rusty's nose. The colt closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. Daniel knew right then. Rusty wasn't waiting for his old rider anymore. He had found his new one. The days passed, and Rusty followed Emma everywhere. She brushed him, fed him, whispered to him when she thought no one was listening. One afternoon, Daniel found her sitting in the field beside Rusty, hugging his neck. Her voice was quiet. "I still miss him, but I think he sent you to me." Rusty let out a deep breath, as if he understood. Daniel turned away, swallowing the lump in his throat, because some horses weren't meant to stay lost. Some horses were meant to bring lost people home. Emma and Rusty had become inseparable, but there was still one thing left. She had never ridden him. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel found Emma standing by the fence, watching Rusty in the pasture. She was quiet, thinking. Daniel leaned against the fence. "You ready?" Emma hesitated. "What if he doesn't want me to ride him?" Daniel smiled. "Then we don't force him. But I think he's been waiting for this, just like you." Emma took a deep breath and nodded. Rusty stood calmly as Daniel helped her into the saddle. The moment she settled, Rusty flicked his ears, then let out the softest sigh. like he remembered this feeling, like it felt right. Daniel stepped back. "Okay, Emma, just let him walk." Emma took a shaky breath and lightly touched the reins. Rusty moved, not hesitantly, not nervously, but surely, as if he had been waiting his whole life for her to be there. Emma laughed, a real bright laugh. Daniel grinned. "Looks like you found each other, huh?" Emma nodded, eyes shining. "Yeah, I think we did." That night, Emma stayed late, brushing Rusty under the barn lights. Daniel watched from a distance, giving them their space. Then, Emma whispered something. Daniel barely caught it, but it sent shivers down his spine. "Thank you for sending him to me, big brother." Rusty lifted his head, ears forward, and in that moment, Daniel swore. It felt like Rusty understood, like he had been waiting for that whisper. Like, finally, after all this time, he was home. Days turned into weeks. Emma and Rusty grew closer, their bond deepening in a way that words couldn't fully capture. But there was still one thing Emma hadn't done: ride Rusty outside the ranch. Daniel knew why. Leaving the ranch meant stepping into the unknown, and Emma was still afraid of what the world might take from her. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Daniel approached Emma, who was braiding Rusty's mane. "Let's go for a ride," he said casually. Emma hesitated, her hands pausing. "Outside the ranch." Daniel nodded. "Just to the meadow. Nothing scary. Just you, Rusty, and the open sky." Emma swallowed, glancing at Rusty. Rusty nudged her shoulder as if to say, "I'm with you." She took a deep breath. "Okay." Chapter 51. Facing the Fear. They rode in silence at first. The only sounds were the soft crunch of hooves on fallen leaves and the distant call of birds. Rusty was calm, steady, his ears flicking back to listen to Emma's every breath. Then, they reached the meadow. Golden grass stretched out before them, the wind whispering through the fields. Emma's hands tightened on the reins. Daniel rode beside her on Daisy, keeping his voice soft. "You're safe, Emma. Rusty won't let anything happen to you." Emma bit her lip. "What if I fall?" Daniel smiled. "Then you get back up, just like Rusty did." Emma was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Okay." She loosened the reins. Rusty flicked his ears, waiting. Emma took a deep breath. And then, she nudged him forward. At first, it was a slow trot, then a canter, and then, Emma leaned forward, laughing. And Rusty ran, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the joy of knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. Daniel watched as they galloped across the meadow, Emma's laughter carried by the wind. She wasn't holding on for dear life anymore. She was holding on for the love of it. And Rusty wasn't waiting anymore. He had found her, and she had found him. Daniel exhaled, his heart full, because this was why he saved horses. Not just to heal them, but to heal people too. That night, after the ride, Daniel found Emma sitting by Rusty's stall, holding a folded piece of paper. She looked up at him, hesitating. "Can you help me with something?" Daniel nodded. "Of course." Emma stood and walked outside. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of the evening grass. She unfolded the paper. A letter. To her brother. Her voice was soft. "I wrote this a long time ago, but I never knew how to send it." Daniel's throat tightened. And now, Emma smiled, tears in her eyes. "Now I do." She took a deep breath and let go. The wind caught the letter, lifting it high into the sky, carrying it away. Rusty lifted his head, ears pricked, watching it disappear into the horizon. Emma wiped her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel heavy anymore. She felt free, just like Rusty. As the letter disappeared into the sky, Emma exhaled a breath she didn't even know she had been holding. Rusty nudged her shoulder, his warm breath against her cheek. Daniel watched quietly. Some moments didn't need words. Some moments were just felt. Emma turned to Rusty and whispered, "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Rusty didn't answer, of course, but the way he stood beside her, calm, steady, unshaken, it was answer enough. Chapter 55. The storm that tested everything. For the next few weeks, everything felt lighter. Emma laughed more. Rusty moved with more confidence. But life had a way of testing the strongest bonds. And the test came one evening when the storm hit. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the stable doors. Thunder rumbled, deep and threatening. Daniel rushed outside, rain soaking through his shirt. He checked on all the horses, making sure they were safe. Then he saw it. The pasture gate. It was open. And Rusty was gone. Emma's scream cut through the storm. Rusty! Daniel grabbed a flashlight and ran. Emma, stay inside. But she was already bolting toward the pasture. The rain was blinding. The wind was deafening. But none of it mattered, because Rusty was out there. And Emma wasn't going to lose him, too. They searched for what felt like forever. Then, a flicker of movement in the distance. Emma's heart pounded. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted through the storm. Rusty, please. For a moment, silence. Then, a shadow moved. A familiar shape. Rusty. He stood at the edge of the woods, his body tense, his ears flicking at every crack of thunder. Emma didn't hesitate. She ran. Lightning flashed. Rusty reared back, fear flashing in his eyes. Emma slowed, her voice shaking. It's okay, boy. I'm here. Rusty snorted, shifting nervously. He was scared, lost, just like he had been before. Emma's hands trembled, but then she did the only thing she could. She took a deep breath and reached out, not with her hands, but with her heart. I need you, Rusty. The storm raged. The wind screamed. And then, Rusty moved. Not away. Toward her. One step. Then another. Until finally, he pressed his forehead against her chest. Emma wrapped her arms around him, tears mixing with the rain. And in that moment, the storm didn't matter, because Rusty had chosen her, just like she had chosen him. Daniel found them a few minutes later, Emma still holding on to Rusty, as if letting go would break something inside her. Daniel knelt beside them, his voice soft. Let's go home. Emma nodded. Rusty stayed close, following her without hesitation, because home wasn't just a place. It wasn't a barn or a ranch or a stable. Home was trust, and for the first time since he had lost his boy, Rusty had found home again, and so had Emma. The storm passed, but its impact lingered. The next morning, the ranch was covered in broken branches and soaked fields, but none of that mattered, because Rusty and Emma were safe. Daniel found Emma in the barn, brushing Rusty's coat. She moved slowly, carefully, her fingers tracing the old scars along Rusty's side. She whispered, I wonder if they still hurt. Daniel leaned against the stall door. Maybe not the way they used to. Emma looked up. But they don't go away, do they? Daniel shook his head. No, but sometimes scars aren't just reminders of pain. They're proof that we survived. Emma was quiet for a long time. Then she turned back to Rusty, her voice barely above a whisper. We survived, didn't we, boy? Rusty nuzzled her gently, and somehow Emma knew. They were healing together. A few days later, Daniel found Emma in the pasture, sitting in the grass with Rusty beside her. She looked different, lighter, freer, like something inside her had finally let go. Daniel smiled. How about another ride? Emma hesitated, then grinned. Where to? Daniel climbed onto Shadow. Let's find out. She laughed and swung onto Rusty's back, and together, they rode, through the golden fields, through the wind and the sunlight, through the past, the pain, the memories that once held them back. Because some journeys aren't about distance. Some journeys are about coming home to yourself. And on that day, as Rusty galloped beneath her, Emma knew. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And Rusty was, too.